Hello, everyone. Welcome to Workforce Priorities, where we're talking about how to attract, hire, and retain the right people for today's behavioral health world. My name is Naomi Weinstein, and I work at ICL. Today we're going to be talking about some interviewing tools that we've developed as part of this project. So to get started, I want to just remind everyone of the same slide that we've been showing every time, the key question here in terms of strategic processes and human resources, which is, does the organization have the systems in place to ensure that the right people with the right skills do the right things to get the right outcomes and will stay with you? And so part of that process is being able to interview smartly to make sure that those right people are coming in the door. Okay. So the first premise is that every interview should be guided by a standard set of interview questions that focuses on the primary responsibilities and skills that are needed in order to be successful in this job. And I say standard set of interview questions because you want to be able to compare candidate to candidate, and it's very difficult to do that if you're just kind of going ad hoc onto various questions and conversations depending on who's in front of you. If you have a standard set of questions, you can ask the same things each time. And we're talking about the primary responsibilities and skills rather than qualifications or personality or connections or anything else like that. All right, so these are just some typical questions that I found on Glassdoor.com. And you can see that they are not all the greatest questions, right? So there's a tell me about your strengths and weaknesses question, or how do you handle stress, which are both pretty vague. A little more specific to behavioral health, how well do you get along with young people? What do boundaries mean to you? Why do you want to work with this population? All of those don't really get you to the information that you're going to need in order to discern between one person and another and as to who is the right candidate for the position. There are two examples here of behavioral questions, and behavioral questions are kind of give me an example of. So we have here provide an example of a stressful situation you had to resolve and what you did to handle it properly. Or tell us about a time you had to effectively diffuse a situation so no one got hurt. And in some ways you might think those are great questions. You're asking very specific things, but you're not really. You're asking how do people do things successfully rather than just opening it up generally. And by asking for success, you can't have people giving you answers that are not desirable, just by definition. So we'll talk in a few minutes about how to get more open questions so we get a broad range of answers. So the first thing, as I said, you want to do is you're going to ask questions that relate to someone's specific job responsibilities and skills. So what you need to do first is develop the job description. Now, together with this webinar, we have provided a short paper, a short supplemental resource on how to write good job descriptions from a recovery-oriented perspective. In your job description, you're going to have responsibilities, you're going to have key skills, you're going to have desired qualifications as well. Your second step is to use the job description to develop your interview questions, right? You should always have the job description in front of you so that your interview questions relate specifically back to the responsibilities and skills that you're looking for. So the best interview questions in terms of kind of best practice incorporate these kinds of elements. So the first is you're not asking about every single job responsibility. You're asking about the 5 to 6 most essential job responsibilities. The questions should target a combination of soft skills, knowledge, attitudes, and then more technical skills, right? And in terms of technical skills, just thinking about the fact that people have found that past behavior is a pretty good predictor of future behavior, which is why you ask things like, tell me about a time that you blah, blah, blah. You should avoid questions that lead only to a success story. So tell me about a time you successfully resolved something is not a great question. And a lot of times, and maybe some of you have experienced this as well, I certainly have, where I'm interviewing somebody and I ask several different questions, but each question I end up getting a response that leads back to the same example. You can ask for a different example for every single situation that you pose. You shouldn't assume that a one-time example is the same as a frequent behavior either. All right. You can ask follow-up questions for detail and also to get a sense of how common this performances. And then if you're seeking out high performers, you want to look for two additional elements. One is this kind of work a passion for the person? And the second is, what's their kind of can-do attitude and self-motivation? And the reality behind these 2 points is that work life is filled with obstacles, especially work life in behavioral health, right? The reason we all have jobs is because clients are experiencing obstacles and then exhibiting sometimes challenging behavior. If it were really easy, none of us would be employed. Given that, we need to have people who are able to get past obstacles. We're going to keep going even when the work gets really, really tough. So we always want to look for job fit and can-do attitudes when we're looking for the highest performers. So first I want to just mention a couple of soft skills. Now, it may be that if you're making computers, soft skills aren't important, but certainly in the behavioral health world, soft skills are essential, right? So this is just a list of some of the soft skills that I was thinking about that are relevant to behavioral health. So we need to be able to work in teams. We need to be responsible. We need to have good problem-solving skills. We need to be able to manage crises and stay organized. We need to be good decision makers, in part because sometimes we're making decision makers completely on our own. We may be working out in the field, something happens, and we need to make a decision right then and there. We need to have empathy. We need to be good communicators. We need to take initiative. We need to have conflict resolution skills. We need to be trustworthy. We need to demonstrate emotional intelligence, be open to change, have a commitment to learning. That's an essential part of recovery, is being committed to learning onward and ongoing. People need to be independent. They need to have a great sense of customer service, handling pressure, being reliable. All of these skills all relate back to different elements that are important in terms of serving people who have behavioral health challenges. Now, when we're looking at soft skills, we want to ask questions about those. So here are just 4 examples of questions that target needed specific skills. Talk about a change that happened recently in your organization. Do you disagree or agree with the change? How did you deal with that change for yourself and for others? That's a way of talking about a person's openness to change. How do you stay on top of what's happening in the behavioral health field? That might be about trying to understand someone's commitment to learning. Tell me about a situation where you were faced with a tough problem. What did you do? Problem-solving skills. Describe some of the strategies you use to show clients you're trustworthy. Trustworthiness, obviously, and that goes back to being trauma-informed. So all of these kinds of questions are ways to talk about very specific soft skills. One critical soft skill is emotional intelligence. So I just want to mention that one in particular. If we think about emotional intelligence, we could define it as having a kind of combination of self-awareness, the ability to self-regulate, to stay motivated, have empathy for others, and use our social skills. So some questions that we could ask related to emotional intelligence: tell me about a time someone criticized your work. That would demonstrate both self-awareness and self-regulation and might tap into self-motivation as well. Tell me about the last client you saw before coming here. What was that person's mood? Why do you think they felt that way? Tells you a little bit about the person's empathy. Tell me about how you responded to a colleague's success. And you might probe deeper and say, when you yourself were not successful, what are their social skills like, right? So all of those kinds of questions dig into emotional intelligence as one very specific soft skill. So the next thing I want to talk about is about a combination of skills and attitude. So there is a model, an interviewing model, a human resources model called motivation-based interviewing, which for those of us in the behavioral health world seems a lot like motivational interviewing, completely different situation. In motivation-based interviewing, or what they call MBI, what we're looking at is interviewing skills and job interviews where we're trying to ascertain a person's motivation when they're faced with obstacles. So in this model, they call it the OSE model, you pose an obstacle in a situation, one obstacle, one situation at a time, and what you're looking for is what action was taken as a result of this. You want specifics, and then what was the end result. And you're not directing someone towards an example of their success or an example of their failure. You're letting them define the success or failure. All right? So the way you would pose this is, tell me about a time you had to deal with X situation given X obstacle. What would you do? What happened as a result? So here's some examples of questions. Tell me about a time a colleague was rude to you. Right, so there's your situation and your obstacle, the rude colleague. Tell me about a time you were working with a young person who was very aggressive. Tell me about a time you felt defeated. Each of those are obstacles, right? The aggressive young person, feeling defeated, colleague being rude. What did you do? I'm not asking you about tell me about a time when you were able to diffuse a situation in which a young person was very aggressive and you kept everyone safe. That's directing them towards success. I just want to know what happened. So I'm being a lot more open. That combination is going to show me about how you deal with obstacles. Now, I also want to figure out about your passion, right? I was talking about those high performers and being passionate. So questions you could ask are things like, out of all the jobs you've held, what was your favorite? Out of all the jobs you've held, which was your least favorite? Right? And those kinds of things, what you're going to listen for is what's the match between their preferences and the responsibilities of this job that they're interviewing for. If you have someone who just loves being out in the field and their passion is meeting people, in the community, and they worked on an ACT team, for example, and they love going and doing their laundry with it, doing the person's laundry together and teaching them skills for grocery shopping and all those recovery skills, and you say that this is much more of a desk job, it's a clinic job, they're working on the same issues, but they're sitting at a desk in a clinic, that may not be a great match. So you're listening for those kinds of things, right? Another question, this is from a different model, not the MBI model, this is another model. What would you consider your most significant achievement in your career so far? Now, each of those questions is typically used with somebody who's been working for a long time. You can also modify these questions for people who are newer to the field or are just getting out of school by asking about projects in school or classes in school, extracurriculars, and those kinds of things to get at these same issues. What I want to do now is I just want to introduce you a little bit to some recommended interview questions that we have developed. And the idea is to address attitudes, knowledge, and practices about 3 topics: recovery-focused approaches, trauma-informed care, and integrated or whole health perspectives. So I'm going to focus first on recovery. And this is just, you see a screenshot of 2 pages of interview questions that we've developed. And as you can see here, each section starts off with some soft skills that are relevant to this topic, recovery in this case, and then there are categories of questions. All right? So let me just go over recovery in specific first, and then we'll talk about trauma and then whole health. So these are just some of the soft skills that are important for being recovery-focused. So you can see here collaboration, continuous learning, empathy, patience, strengths-based approaches, non-judgmental listening, power sharing, unconditional support of others. So you can ask questions specifically about any or all of those soft skills, and that will help you understand someone's the skills that they're going to bring into a recovery-focused approach, even if they don't have a lot of experience with recovery-based approaches in the past. If you have somebody who comes in with a strong belief in recovery based on their attitudes towards the general concepts and they're skilled at power sharing and empathy and continuous learning, that may be a really great candidate, even though they've never worked in the recovery-focused environment. So here's just a sampling of the questions that are on those 2 pages. So in terms of understanding of recovery and person-centered care principles, what do you do in your work with clients that would demonstrate to an observer that your approach is recovery-based? You can ask about people's attitudes towards recovery and person-centered care. From your experience, what kinds of goals are appropriate for clients to work towards? What goals would you consider inappropriate? You could talk about openness to client participation in treatment planning. How do you respond when a client shares a goal that is not achievable or reasonable in your mind? Now, notice I've been using the word client here in part because we've got listeners from substance abuse, from mental health, and from other behavioral health fields. And I know there's a lot of different uses of language, and some people are talking about participants and service recipients and consumers and people. And I just want to make sure that I tried to use the terminology that was shortest, so I chose client, but feel free to amend as needed. Some other questions you might ask, you could ask about someone's understanding or work towards different recovery outcomes, such as employment. Tell me about how you work with clients who want to work. And then how would you support employment if the person is hearing voices or continues to use substances? You can ask questions about being a recovery-focused practitioner. Tell me about a situation working with a client that made you lose hope. Right? Sometimes we lose hope. And yet, as a recovery-focused practitioner, our job is to hold the hope for others. And so how do we put those pieces together? You could even ask about things like recovery orientation in the workplace. If you're in charge of the physical environment of your program, what would you do to make a recovery philosophy stand out? What would that place look like? These are all questions that will get at a person's knowledge, skills, and attitudes about recovery. So now I want to focus on trauma. So first we're going to talk about some of those soft skills: empathy, non-judgmental listening, de-escalation, empowerment, trustworthiness, dependability and reliability, strengths-based, and problem solving. Those are all soft skills related to trauma-informed care. So some questions you might ask. Describe the things you do to create an environment that is trauma-informed. You can ask about how people deal with crisis situations. Tell me about a time when you had to respond quickly in a crisis. Talk about your work with a client with a trauma history. What coping skills did you work on with this person, and what was the outcome? Focusing here on how do we create safety. We can look specifically at for people who are working with children, youth, and families. Please share any ideas you have for building resilience in youth who have experienced trauma. And then I have questions. We have questions on both the trauma one and on the whole health one for candidates who are interviewing for supervisory or leadership positions. So describe ways you both model and encourage trauma-informed care and practice for your team. Or what strategies have you built into your work to build resilience on your team and address secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, and burnout? These are all questions that are going to get to the trauma knowledge, attitudes, and skills. And again, there's about 2 pages full of questions. And then the last of the 3 tools focuses on integrated health. And by integrated health, we're talking about a combination of the overlap between physical health and behavioral health, as well as an awareness and incorporation of social determinants of health into the picture to get kind of a whole health perspective. So some soft skills that we need are collaboration, right? Because you may be, if you're a behavioral health worker, you may be reaching out to a medical team. How do you collaborate? What's your communication skills? Are you comfortable asking questions when you don't understand things? What's your approach to continuous learning? You may be having to learn new diagnoses and medical pieces. What's your empathy like? How are you at non-judgmental listening? What are your observation and awareness skills, right? Some questions you might want to ask in an interview in terms of scope of practice. What do you think is meant by the term whole health, and what is the role of behavioral health in addressing whole health? Some behavioral health practitioners think that physical health is not any of their business. Other people think it's definitely within their scope of practice. That might be a question that you might want to ask somebody. You might ask about, here's another question in terms of information sharing. Talk about how you have used technology to help you focus on the well-being of a client. What tool did you use? How did you use it? So maybe you're sharing an app for managing your diabetes, or maybe you brought in some brochures about hypertension, all right? I would be curious about what health topics a candidate finds challenging to discuss with clients. Right? Are they talking about finding it challenging or uncomfortable to talk about sexuality or substance use? How do they do it? How do you bring up a challenging topic with a client? I'm curious about what's challenging, and then how do they go about getting around that challenge rather than avoidance. And, I'm also interested in how do we support people. So here's an example. You make a home visit to a client who's been showing signs of increased isolation because of a lingering cough. While at the home, you notice a window that doesn't close properly and some mold in the bathroom. What do? Do you call facilities? Do you clean it? Do you work with a client to clean it? I want to know what happens next. Talk about your work with a client who is not taking good care of his health. What does that look like? And again, for candidates for supervisory and leadership positions, as a leader, how do you encourage your staff to think about the connection between physical and behavioral health challenges? So those are the 3 interview question guides. And as I mentioned, we also have a guide on writing job descriptions. Our next 3 and the final 3 webinars of this series are focused on managing performance, which will be a live webinar on September 17th, and a webinar on employee engagement on October 1st. And on October 15th, we'll be releasing an entire toolkit on pre-employment resources, including a pre-employment screening tool, how these interview questions relate back to that screening tool, a performance measures tool as well, and hopefully this will all kind of come together then. So thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope this has been helpful, and we'll hopefully see you in September. Thanks.